All right, hello everyone. So in this lecture, we're going to continue where we left off last time. We were talking about the cycle of virtue, which can also be the cycle of vice as it relates to something that we'll call the anatomy of action, the anatomy of action. And then we built in St. Augustine's conception of that through the prism of love. So we're going to pick up there and now move deeper into St. Augustine's thought. So again, the basic idea here behind the anatomy of action is that action happening right here is not just a sort of an independent event. It just happened, that there's a process that leads to it. So that's the first insight. The second insight is that this process, this interior process that leads to it, also loops back around in the form of over time becoming habit, and habit over time becoming character, so that what we do ultimately influences, and then we could even say ultimately determines who we become, who we are in the inside. And so that even affects this idea of reason, that we can shift how we see the world for better or for worse, depending upon our actions. So good actions, in a very basic sense, will help us see things more accurately as they actually are, whereas bad actions will eventually distort our understanding of reality. So again, the idea here is things out there aren't changing. Nothing out there is actually changing. What's changing is what's in here, and because of this change, we begin to perceive things differently, and as we begin to perceive things differently, we begin to be able to train our desires. And again, the basic idea here as it relates to love is that we can alter our loves. We can recreate them. We can even create them in the first place, especially with something like agape, where we may have no affection for example, our enemies, zero. It's not there, but through the process of willing and recognizing it as a good and practicing compassion, practicing kindness, practicing not thinking bad thoughts about them or wishing them harm, over time, our disposition can change. To use a very challenging, but also a legitimate example for this model. So circle of virtue, circle of vice. Now, what we left off last time is noting that for Augustine, he adopts this model and then just adds that actually action doesn't originate most primordially in reason. For him, it most primordially it originates in the will, and he calls the will love. So the basic idea here is that what we love determines what we see, which again determines everything after it. Now, as I mentioned at the very end of the last lecture, the idea for Augustine is that we should ultimately only be able to conceive of two loves, two possibilities. So we either, again, as I noted last time, we either love God as our highest good, or we love ourselves. Now, again, when you hear that for the first time, you may think, but there's so many other things that somebody could love besides themselves or besides God. What about sports? What about their career? What about their children? What about their husband or wife? What about their some hobby that they have? How could you say that there's only two things? Here's what he basically has in mind. So for Augustine, human beings are made in the image and likeness of God. This is, of course, mainstream Christian teaching with its roots in Jewish teaching, the Old Testament. And one way in which he very famously puts it in his work called The Confessions is that our hearts are restless until they rest in you. And he's addressing God, the personal God, meaning that we're made for God, and that it's only in finding that relationship and in building that relationship and establishing that relationship and ultimately in resting that relationship that God is inviting us to. So it's never only initiated for Augustine by the person. It's a relationship. It's a mutual relationship that the heart will actually find what it's looking for and be able to attain peace. This is something we'll get into a bit deeper later on in this lecture. And insofar as we're made for God, we're as many have put it before, we're wired for God. We're hardwired for God. The problem, however, is that we act different than according to our nature, which we can, for now, we'll just call that sin, and we'll explain more what that is in just a moment. So even that still may sound abstract. You say, okay, well, he says that, but what's the evidence for that, or why would anybody take that position? And we could look at it this way. So everything that we do in life has some kind of goal associated with it, right? Think here, right, with this model, we're always acting for, reason always has to identify a goal that it is seeking to say, this is the destination. Remember the map metaphor I used, right? When you say you want to navigate somewhere, you have to identify the goal and, of course, the way that you're going to get there. So all action, if it's intelligible, if it's meaningful, if in a literal sense it's not mad, it's not insane, all action is structured by the apprehension and the pursuit of some goal. So that explains why we do everything that we do, is we're goal-oriented. But the insight immediately behind that would be that we're not just, when we're acting for a goal, we're not just acting for one particular goal. We're acting for a goal behind that goal as well. This is something we're going to visit again when we get into the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas. So, for example, you're watching this video. And so I could say to you, well, why are you watching this video? And if you're going to be totally honest with me, you'd probably say something like, I'm watching this video because I want to get a good grade in this class. So there's your action. It explains why you're doing what you're doing, and it's connected to a specific goal that you have in mind, which is getting a good grade. But then I could say, okay, well, but why do you want to get a good grade? And your response might be, because I want to have a high GPA. So you see, even getting a good grade is not your final goal. The goal behind that is getting a high GPA. But then I could say, well, why do you want a high GPA? You see, and you can probably get a sense of where this is going. Well, because I want to get into a good graduate school. Well, why do you want to get into a good graduate school? Because I want to get a good job. Well, why do you want to get a good job? Because I want to make some good money. I mean, I want to do something that I like, but ultimately I need to support myself, and I want to support myself. Well, why do you want to do that? Well, I guess because I want to have a nice home and a nice car and have prestige and some kind of recognition for what I'm doing, and have a family. Well, why do you want to do any of that? And more importantly, what happens when those things conflict? Meaning that all things being equal, you say you want a lot of money, and you want a happy family, and you want a lot of prestige or social recognition. You have those three goals. Well, at some point they're going to conflict, right? It'll either be more time with your family or more time out in the community, attending meetings and giving speeches or whatever may be the case. So they're going to conflict. So at some point you'll have to choose and say, well, there's a higher goal there. And let's say ultimately it's making more money. You just want to make more money. The question is, well, why do you want to make more money? And then the answer would be, well, I want to have some kind of, I don't know, pleasure, some kind of generator of experiences for me so that I can continue to, I don't know. So the point there is that, look, all of us are goal-oriented. Action is only intelligible insofar as it's oriented towards a goal. But those goals are always stepped towards other goals in a hierarchical fashion, so that eventually everything that we can do can be explained by one ultimate goal that we have. Now, for Augustine, that ultimate goal that we're supposed to have, because it's written into our nature, is God. And he believes, a relationship with God, I should say. And he believes that all things being equal, we should be able to have access to God without ever leaving the house. So many religious traditions have a conception of pilgrimage, a conception of entering into a place of trial, into a long path, a place of transformation, basically going somewhere and having something happen to you, putting yourself through an experience in order to find God. Okay, there's a lot to that. But for Augustine, all of that should really be unnecessary. If, again, all things being equal, we're going to build sin into this system in just a moment. Why? Because God is our creator. And so for Augustine, if it's true, and he believes it's true, that each one of us is created by God, both in the sense of God having created the cosmos and everything in it itself, and in the sense of God having created each individual soul in co-creation with human beings who create new life. So we're sort of doubly created in that sense. Then the person or being most intimate to us, even more, as he puts it many times in his confession, even more than himself, is God. And so for God is sort of the condition for the possibility of one knowing that one exists at all. So one of the ways that we can explain that is that, well, look, just do an experiment. So I'm right here, I'm teaching in front of you, I'm recording a video, I can see myself behind the camera gesticulating, and so that immediately creates a split in me. How so? Well, on the one hand, I'm talking to you right now. On the other hand, as I'm talking to you right now, so I'm within the same sort of time and space bar throughout my life as I'm moving from the present into the past and moving into the future, I'm aware of myself talking to you right now. So there's a kind of me that sort of splits up and looks down on me, the I looking at the me, so I become a subject and an object. And so as I'm talking to you, I can be looking at myself interiorly and saying, well, why did he choose to wear those clothes today? Or, was blue really the best color for illustrating this principle? Or, did you remember to shave? Or you're looking a little too scraggy. I mean, you can begin thinking about yourself, right? So there you already see that within you, there's another you that is capable of seeing you as a you that's also an I. So the I, we'll pretend that we're looking out this way. The I here, ultimately, instead of becoming an I, becomes a what? Becomes a me. And then this becomes the I. So we become an object for ourselves. So there already I can see that I'm capable of sort of going in myself and rising up. So I is above the me. Well, we can continue to do that, right? Because I can look at myself looking at myself. So I can look at myself looking at myself looking at myself and say to myself both at the same time, well, what is it that this guy's doing down here? Why is he teaching the way he's doing? But also, what's up with this guy here? Like, why is he noticing these things rather than these things? Why is this person having a negative reaction to him or to his own self? Why did you focus on this rather than that, right? In other words, this can become the I, and this whole thing can become the me. Well, we can continue to play this, right? So I can look at myself, who's looking at myself, who's looking at myself, and ask questions about why this person is looking at this person this way, and this person, and this person, and this person, and ultimately why I'm doing what I'm doing right here in time and space. In other words, this can become the I, and this can become the me. All of this can become the object of my own self-knowledge. Well, here's the point here. For Augustine, we can, and in fact should do this. We're made to. We're self-aware. We know that we're an I. But when we do this process, when we enter into ourselves, what we find is as we go higher and higher and higher, speaking in a conceptual sense, looking down upon ourselves, we realize, you know what? I can make myself a me, but also I can never totally get out of me. Meaning I'm always, and I don't necessarily mean this in a bad way, but in a conceptual way, I'm always trapped within my own being. I can't actually totally step out of myself and see myself purely as an object because it's always I looking at the me. And it's at that moment, it's at that sort of the cusp of where the self-awareness recognizes that there must be something beyond the self-awareness in order for there to be any self at all, where Augustine thinks we can find that kind of unity with God. In other words, that God is kind of the light that illuminates all that whole journey of self into the self and unifies the self as a self, giving giving it boundaries and giving it intelligence and giving it intelligibility that makes it possible to be an I and be a me. So we recognize that there must be some power outside of us that is at the same time not only existent, but also interested in us, cares about us, is invested in us somehow, that makes an I be an I. I know that sounds very complex, but just experiment it. Experiment with it for a while. Just think of yourself as yourself, and then yourself looking at yourself looking at yourself, you're looking at yourself, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you get to the sense in which, am I really self-generated? Meaning, am I actually, is my own consciousness really sort of sui generis, that it just sort of comes in, it comes out of me and then comes above me? Or does it make more sense to say that my self-consciousness is generated by an external power that makes consciousness itself possible and my own particular consciousness? Augustine will certainly say the latter. So this is how we're made. The idea is that we go into ourself, and as we go into ourself through this sort of self-propelling, but also in cooperation with the power that is outside of his journey upwards, we can find unity with God. So this is how we were made. We were made to have almost, if not totally immediate access to God, because God is our creator. So we shouldn't have to go out to find what is necessarily, in an ontological sense, already within. Okay, that's how we were made. Who have we become? That's the next question. Who we have become for Augustine is that instead of this interior journey that propels us in and up, in which case we ultimately would be doing everything that we do, including everything out in the world, that becomes then referred in and through the self, it would be referred then upward to God. So we were made to rest in God. All of our actions were ultimately made to be directed to that which is outside of the self and outside of space and time, which is to say God. That's how we're made. And that's the one option of where our loves can be. But by definition, if we're not loving something outside of time and space, the transcendent, by definition, we're therefore loving, insofar as we must love something, we're therefore loving something inside time and space. Or in other words, something of the world. And what Augustine thinks ultimately, the ultimate form that love always takes, if we're loving something in the world, is it always comes back to being self-referential. In other words, it always somehow ends up being an expression of self-idolatry, living as if I were my own highest good, and therefore everything that I desire becomes the goal that I seek to obtain. So instead of having this journey up, inward, and upward, for Augustine, the problem of sin is what we do is we reach out into the world, but instead of going up, instead of going out into the world, back into the self and up, we do this. We go, ooh, right back into the self. We burrow into ourself. We dig deeper and deeper into our own particular existence. That's where we burrow our loves. That's what explains everything that we ultimately do is self-love. Not in the proper theological sense of self-love, meaning love your neighbor as yourself, which we'll get into this later in other lectures, but basically has a Trinitarian model of love in mind, in which the I and the me seek each other's good in an objective sense. We'll get to that. But self-love understood as believing in some explicit or implicit way that I am my own God, that I am my own creator. Now, for Augustine, that's actually delusional. Like, it's actually, it's the ravings of a madman to say, this is Augustine speaking, that I can create myself, because it doesn't pass the smell test for him, insofar as the condition for the possibility of existence itself is already outside of you. So how could you say that you, in relationship to that existence and everything that makes your existence possible right here and right now, you're going to claim that you are somehow free to fashion that and create that in any way you will. He thinks that's delusional. But all of us, for Augustine, are delusional in that sense. Meaning all of us, what the power of sin does, and this is a form of love he calls cupiditas, where we get our word cupidity, which can mean greed, like it's like a hunger for the self, an avaricious self-attraction that burrows us back into ourself. And insofar as we move into ourself, we move away from God. And insofar as we move away from God, we move into non-being. Remember, God is isness. His name in the Old Testament is I am. I am he who is. I exist is the biblical formulation of it. So to move away from God is not to move into a different ontological space. It's to move into nothingness. But remember, that's precisely the power that human beings have with the misuse of their freedom. So you see, here's the problem. Applying all of this, moving it from a theological and ontological to a moral sense, is that if this is true, and Augustine thinks it's obviously true, he thinks sort of the easiest thing to prove in human existence is this kind of primordial selfishness that's, one, unnecessary, and two, dominates all human life in one way or another. If that's true, then that means that the love that we have here, instead of it being this love for God, which for Augustine would put all things in their proper relationship to each other, we'd see things as they actually are, because that's not the love we have here, and we have the self-love, well, then the way that we reason is not only motivated by, but determined by that self-love. So we don't actually, when we're out there saying, what should I do with my life? How should I treat this person? What kinds of goals should I pursue? What kinds of relationships should I be in? How should I spend my free time? If we're asking all these questions, if we're asking them all in the paradigm of self-love, then basically the way we see the world is through the prism of this question: how can I get what I want to fulfill my desires? Now, we can socialize that in different ways, right? We can hide that that primordial sinful impulse from each other. We can sort of hide it in through the acquisition of material goods, through sort of romantic or pseudo-romantic, I should say, interactions with other people, where you're just trying to sort of play games in order to just get to pounce on what you want. And I know that sounds perhaps sort of shocking, but from Augustine's model, that's precisely, people are just acting like animals, but socializing that in a particular kind of way to sort of hide from ourselves what we know we're actually doing, but don't want to face directly. And so we play these kind of psychological games with each other to pretend that we're not all actually ravenous beasts who are trying to get what we want in a very primordial sense, but rather intelligent and sophisticated and civil people, which I guess would just say nonsense, not in a state of sin, which he thinks applies to all of us without exception. There's not one group of people who's extra sinful or one group of people who's a little less. It's like, it's the human nature now, not how we're created, how we made ourselves, to be, and we'll use this word more as we move on, addicted to ourself, truly addicted to ourself. And so everything we get, just like the addict who's looking out in the world, like everything that dominates the addict's mind is, how do I get high? We're addicted to ourselves. So everything, according to Augustine, so everything that dominates our mind is, how do I get what I want right now? How do I fulfill these hungers that I have? And that makes us more and more and more become into that cycle of vice, conform our lives to that self-love. All right, so this is looking, it's looking pretty dark, and I'll explain in a moment where Augustine thinks the possibility lies for perhaps getting out of this. But this is his starting point, is that, again, if we have self-love here, then it's going to contaminate and pollute the entire process. So I'm about to try something I've never tried before on the videos. I actually drew a diagram on the other side of this board that we're going to get to now. Looks like it's going to work. All right. Okay. So in this diagram here, what I'm trying to show is how this model that we just looked like on the other side and this model of becoming what we do maps onto a broader sense of who human beings are, of who God is, what humanity looks like in totality, and what each individual life looks like. So I'll explain what this means. And we'll call this diagram, we'll call it the ontological structure of choosing. And I'll explain what that means. Basically, what Augustine is going to be arguing is that based upon where we are on this diagram, that determines how we are capable of choosing with regards to choosing the good or not choosing the good. So that's what that ontological part means. We can actually be, in an ontological sense, in different positions in relationship to God. Just a brief note on this sort of strategy for talking about how to be in relationship with God. Make sure. Is that oftentimes, one of the criticisms of biblical theology can be, well, if God is eternal and God is in that sense unchanging, well, then why do we get all this language of God, especially in the Old Testament, all this language of God making decisions or acting or reacting? What does that mean? Well, two responses. One, insofar as human beings are free, then God responds to free human decisions. So that doesn't change who God is, but insofar as we change in relationship to God, then that response, the response itself responds to what we're doing. Because again, within this whole model is we're free. We're free. So depending upon what we do, God responds to that. So that can accommodate for some change with some very expressing change in a very careful way. Put more deeply in a second sense is that it's not God who changed, it's our positioning in relationship to God. And so if as we move away from God, then it's true God can appear more and more terrifying and more absent as we move away. But that's because of our movement away from God. Remember, we are free to move into nothingness. Whereas as we move closer to God, we may see different dimensions of God that were otherwise not present to us or invisible to us, not because God changed or God hid them, but because we were not in the right spot to see them. This is one of the fundamental insights of the relationship between faith and belief and trust and reason, is that only if you get that whole package together and right will you actually be able to see God to the extent it's possible as a human God in the totality of who God is. So something like that is operating in this model. So let me explain it. The model starts off with God and ends with God. So this should sound familiar from working with Genesis. So God creates something other than God, and we call that creation. And as part of creation, we have the creation of humanity. Remember, humanity specifically made in the image of likeness of God, which we talk about it extensively what that means. Now, as created, human beings were able not to sin. That was our ontological structure. Able not to sin. Now, what that means translated is that there's no reason that we had to sin. There's no reason that we had to say no to God and yes to death. That was purely our own free choice. God didn't set us up to fail. God did not create anything that made us do what we did. Now, a good question that I oftentimes get is, well, what about that snake? What about that snake? Isn't the snake bad because of what the snake's doing? I mean, the snake in Genesis and in trying to get Eve to eat of that fruit that ultimately leads them to the fall, into disobedience. One way to address that is to first and foremost go back to the principle that nothing God creates is in of itself evil, given the nature of God, so all creation is good. So any actually real snakes out there would be good as well as part of God's creation. So the point is then, well, the snake is representing something. What is the snake representing? And the sort of the most mainstream answer to this, with strong biblical support, if you look at the Bible in its entirety, Old Testament and New Testament, but even if you stick in the New Testament, is that the snake represents the presence of a pre-existing evil in the world, not that God created, but that has already sort of made its choice. Now, what is that evil? Fallen angels. So if you're you want to take this whole model seriously, even just to try and understand it from the outside to the extent it's possible. You're saying that God is and God exists. I would just say this so hypothetically. And if it's true that God exists, well, then God can create something other than God. There's nothing conceptually incoherent about that. And God can create something that we call matter, but God can also create something that we call spirit or soul. And God can also create beings who are not a unity of matter and soul, which would be us, human beings, but could also just create what? Souls. Souls that are disembodied in the sense that have never had bodies. Well, you know what the name for those are from a biblical perspective? It's angels. So God creates angels as well. And there's lots of angels in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Angels are a central figure oftentimes of what's going on and how God is acting in the world. So to tie this back to the snake, the idea is that in the creation of angels, God also creates beings who are free and rational. And insofar as they're free and rational, they too have the choice of saying yes to their creator, yes to God, of becoming fully what they are, or like us, saying no and moving into a kind of death. And according to both the Old Testament and New Testament traditions, angels, some choose no. They fall. And what does that mean? Is that they continue to be in existence. Why? Well, because again, we have a conception of a God here who doesn't just wipe out of existence, not a total nihilism in the sense that everything goes. Even in the story of Noah, the world is still there. So you get Noah and all the animals preserved, but also the world is still there. The cosmos is still there. So it's not that there's a total evacuating of the universe of existence. So we have a God here who keeps things in existence and who also creates freedom and then recognizes freedom as freedom. So fallen angels are in existence just as bad people are in existence. Bad meaning who've chosen bad wills, who've become the bad things that they do on the inside and the outside. And so God it recognizes the existence of that freedom. And what the demonic, that's the definition of the demonic, what the demonic seeks then is to replicate itself in the form of creating more adherence to the no to God. And in that sense, to the yes to death. So we get that in the serpent, right? The serpent's motivated by seeking to entice Eve and Adam to his side, which is the side of death, which is the side of the absence of God. But note a few things here, two things in particular. One, the snake cannot force Eve to bite, right? The snake does not have the power, in a literal sense, to open up Eve's mouth and to shove the apple in, and to make her chew, and then do the same to Adam and make him chew, right? The only power that the serpent actually has is through persuasion, through the seeking of making something that is actually poison for Adam and Eve appear desirable, appear tasty. So the devil or the demonic power is limited in this theological paradigm radically. It can only function, it can only have power if it's invited, if it's allowed by human beings to act. Otherwise, it is literally powerless. It can't do anything without some kind of invitation, some kind of free invitation. Here's the second point. The devil is oftentimes called in theological literature the father of lies. So what does it mean to be engaged in a lie? Well, and perhaps I've touched on this before, but it bears repeating right now. In order to engage in a lie, in order to lie, especially if one's deliberately intending to lie, like that's exactly what you're trying to do is to lie, is a lie must presuppose the existence of the truth in order for what? For the lie to exist. In other words, the lie can't exist. It's impossible for a lie to exist at all were it not for the pre-existing truth. Now, the flip side's not the same. It's not the case that in order for truth to exist, a lie must exist, which again gets this idea between the relationship between good and evil. Truth is the same as isness. It just is. It doesn't need a opposite reality to sustain it. It just is in existence. Truth doesn't need lies. Goodness doesn't need evil. But the opposite's not the case. Lies need truth. Goodness need evil. So in that sense, lies are like a parasite. Well, the demonic is precisely that. It's like a parasite. Insofar as, in order for the demonic even to exist, God must first exist. Right? Because the demonic, insofar as we conceive of the demonic also as a being whose being depends upon another being, demonic is not a rival God, which is conceptually impossible in this model. That being must first exist upon God. And so that means everything that the being says must also borrow from the being that exists in order to twist it in such a way to create something that's distorted. So that's what we get in what the serpent tells Adam and Eve, right? Tells them half-truths, 10% truths. Takes something like saying, God's afraid that you will be like God. And to make that sound like God's jealous, that God just doesn't want human beings to be like God because God's God, and this is God's kingdom. He doesn't want any competition. To make that sound like God's just this peevish fellow up in the sky who wants to keep humans in their right place, when actually it's true that God doesn't want human beings to be like God. Why? Because the only way they could truly be like God in any substantive sense would be what? To create something that doesn't exist, which is what? Evil. So yes, God doesn't want human beings to create evil. Why? Because the evil they create will come back and consume them. So it's, again, why did I go into that digression? It's because, again, at this level of creation, we could say there's a pre-existing evil, but only if we recognize that evil also follows a similar pattern to the formulation of evil that we see in human beings creating it, and recognizing that evil has sharp limits, that it can't force human beings to sin. Now, what we've traced up until this point in many different ways is that, nevertheless, human beings do sin. And we call that event in the Christian theological tradition the fall. So human becomes less than what they actually are. They fall from their nature, and in falling from their nature, they actually create a kind of secondary nature that replaces their original nature. And Augustine calls that condition the condition of living in original sin. Living in original sin. And then that sin sort of taking root and overcoming the individual more and more. So as we move from creation and not being able to sin, we then move into a situation in which all human beings now are sinners. And there I need to pause again, because it's like, you can say, well, it doesn't seem fair, right? Why doesn't every human just get a blank slate? Why is it this idea that because of what other people do, I have to be punished too? It's not that's not the right paradigm for understanding what these ideas are seeking to communicate. It's more something along the lines that one of the mysteries about being human is that even if humanity were recreated every single day for millions of years, is that human beings would, given the exact same variables from this tradition perspective, repeat the exact same thing. Like, we can't imagine a scenario in which human beings would not be disobedient to God in the way that we've described in particular. And so it's not the fact that human beings are inheriting this evil that has come before them, and it's not their fault, and they're just sort of now been destined to be evil. There's something about us, according to this tradition, in which we just will keep repeating the same pattern. And that's one of the reasons that the traditions call it the mystery of evil. We don't quite know why we're bent on destroying ourselves and others in this kind of delusional way where we truly believe we're the source of our own existence and value. So that's one answer. The other answer is that that sin is not sort of a circuit in which, the current runs its course and then ends. it's a circuit in the sense of that it not only goes back into the self, but it creates patterns of life. It creates structural, cultural, institutional residues out in the world that as more people are pumped into those structures, more people are born and raised, then the residues that individuals individually and collectively have left affect those people in ways that, and we have to be very careful here from this small, it doesn't make them evil, but it makes being good even harder to do. And this is one of the insights of sociology, right? It can be taken too far. It can be absolutized, which this model would totally reject. One of the insights of sociology is that, look, patterns do tend, not always, tend to reproduce themselves. So it's one of the saddest things you can see, you can deal with. You see children who were raised in these terrible circumstances, who were abused, have a much higher probability of also committing abuse, right? Now, that doesn't say that, they're destined to, or they must, or that they have no freedom with the matter. We're just looking at how certain kinds of patterns reproduce themselves. And so original sin can also be understood through that lens as well, is that human beings making choices over time will create certain kinds of patterns that will then exacerbate things, sometimes to a significant degree. So with sort of getting a more nuanced view of what it means to be living post-fall, the idea is that for Augustine, we are all in this situation in which we're not able not to sin. We're not able not to sin. What does that mean? We can't not sin. Now, here's the thing. He says all of us in this situation of not able not to sin, that's where we all are. None of us cannot not sin. This nevertheless is a situation of free choice, that we all have free choice. So he's making these two claims. All of us are not able not to sin, and we have free choice. So the immediate question there is like, what? How? That sounds like a direct contradiction. To say that people are not able not to sin sounds like definitionally that they're not free. So Augustine's a very smart guy. He's not going to be making any clumsy mistakes in terms of just making overt contradictions. So he's obviously up to something here. So what is he up to? Well, I've used this term addiction. I've used this term. I've used drugs as an example. I've used alcohol as an example. And here's now where I want to burrow into that a little more deeply, because I think it really helps explain what Augustine has in mind here. So I want you to think, for example, of somebody who is a very sick alcoholic, meaning somebody who's at the pit of his or her disease. And that person is standing before a store it's a superstore called Bevmo, which if you haven't lived in California for a while, Bevmo is like a Costco-sized building or Walmart-sized building, but it's basically just full of alcohol. So it's the whole warehouse full of booze. So think of an alcoholic standing before the automatic doors of a Bevmo, and ask yourself this: is he or she free? It can sound like a strange question. Well, free. What do you mean free? Is she or he free to choose to go in or not to go in? And again, for the sake of argument, we're assuming here somebody who is in the very depths of their disease. What Augustine would say is this, using the analogy and applying to his theology, is that person's not free actually with regards to whether or not she's going to go in or not go in. Like, you're truly sick, you're going to go in. You're going to go in. You can't not go in. And whatever small temptation, or sorry, that would be the wrong word. Whatever small will inside of you is still trying to pushing you out the other way, insofar as you're at the pit of your disease, it's gone, or almost gone. It's so faint you can barely even detect it. So the person's going to go in. But once that person is in the Bevmo, that person is genuinely free to choose any form of drink to get drunk that they want. They can go down the whiskey aisle, the cognac aisle, the tequila aisle. They can go down the novelty drink aisle, where they sell like whiskey in a glass hat. They can go down the boxed wine aisle. They can go down the fine wine aisle. I mean, with some some restrictions built in terms of how much money they have, but that's totally up to them. Well, for Augustine, that's our situation, is we are actually not free not to be addicted to ourselves. We're not free. We are addicted to ourselves. We can't not be addicted to ourselves. And like the alcoholic who's so in the depths of his or her disease, the biggest problem that we have as we're moving through our own individual life is that we deny we have a problem. I mean, most of us, I'll note an exception here in just a moment. Most of us probably think, yeah, I'm a pretty good guy. I mean, yeah, I've got some things that that I can improve upon. But all in all, I mean, if there's a God, like, I'm going to heaven. I mean, I'm not going to tell that to anybody, maybe a few people, but like, come on, it's me, right? Like, who in the right mind would send me anywhere else but heaven? I'm pretty good. In my heart of hearts, I believe it. So I'm like the drunk who says, look, I like to have fun, right? I like to party once in a while, but I have it totally under control, and I can quit at any time. That's a situation Augustine thinks we are all in this situation of not being able not to sin. Is we're blind to the fact, and that's the worst part of this, is we can't even see this level of reason how twisted our loves are. But here's the thing. We are and remain free in how we express that self-love. So for some people, that expression of self-love is going to be just making as much money as possible. For some people, that expression of self-love is going to take the form of taking any opportunity they have, even small opportunities, to demonstrate their power and control over other people's lives, even if it's only like in a receptionist's desk or something, in a doctor's office, or at the DMV or something like that. Like whatever possibility they have to make someone else's life miserable, and to let them know that they have power and control of them, they're going to use. For some people, it can be a kind of never taking responsibility. Like, I'm going to be a Peter Pan my whole life, and I'm never going to grow up. And so in and through that, what the form that's going to take is, I'm never going to take a responsibility for any relationship that I have. So I'm going to enjoy them while they last and then kick them to the curb when I get bored. It can be, even for Augustine, somebody who goes to church every single day for daily mass, but is, sits at the very front of the church, and during the whole mass is thinking about, I want everybody here, and maybe they never admit this, but they think it, I want everybody here to know how holy I am and how much I love God. Everybody here is going to think of me and think, what a holy man, what a holy woman. That, for Augustine, is just another iteration of self-love. So the point is we're not free to be addicted to ourselves. We're addicted to ourselves. But we are free in how we choose to live out that addiction. And for Augustine, without outside help, without, to use the word in the same genre, intervention, what's going to happen is that throughout our lives, we're just going to burrow deeper and 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 deeper into ourselves until we have this event called death, whatever it may be. And death will be sort of the finality. It'll be kind of the cessation of, by definition, our temporal life. And in that moment, now that we're separated from our body and separated from all these social structures and all the people around us, we become totally isolated, and we've moved into such distance away from isness, away from being, away from the actuality of God's existence, remember, which is life. We've been sort of dying slowly our whole lives, moving into nothingness, that death is just sort of the final marker of a permanent move into nothingness, which is hell. So hell oftentimes is conceived of, especially in sort of generic or superficial understandings of religiosity or Christianity in particular. It's like, we know what hell is like. It's like the desert of Arizona, but somehow everything's on fire, like rocks are burning. And of course, there's these little red men with the triangular tails, like poking people and delighting and cackling. And fair enough, speaking from within the theological tradition, like hell is terrifying. It's terrifying. But the placeness of hell as like a landscape is somewhat misleading, at least from within Augustine's thought and within Christian thought more generally. Why? Because hell's not a place. It's the absence of place. It's being in a place that is no place for all eternity, that's isolated from any kind of other person or other feature of existence that would orient you and hold you up and sort of and hold you together. It's like it's becoming death while still being alive. And one way to think about what that might be like is it's like an eternal depression where you cannot be with yourself, but cannot not be with yourself at the same time. And it's not that death is a way out of this, right? It's not that, well, I can end it all right now and I'm somehow, no. I mean, that's the hell of hell, is that there's no way out of this. But here's the point. It's of your own creation. Within these models, and again, this is such a misconception of Christian theology, you don't have God like, you're going to hell and you're going to hell and you're going to hell. When God is damning people, even if you look at things like the book of Revelation, God is recognizing realities that pre-exist. God is not creating those realities. So God's not saying you go to hell. God is saying you go where you were already going. I recognize what you have chosen for yourself. I allow you to be what you have chosen to be or not be in this case. So again, hell is not like God reaching down from the cloud and like pushing particular people like big Vienna sausage fingers into hell. Total misconception. The absence, self-imposed absence for all that is. And we have made it both come into existence and be permanent. Because what death marks is the final death of the death that we have already been living. It's sort of the stamping of death with death. All right, that's really grim. But this is the way he thinks reality actually is, by our own design. By our own design. The question then is, well, what hope do we have? Here's the hope that we have. So all of us are on this situation, moving towards nothingness, dying a little bit each day, or maybe a lot of it each day, doing so freely. God can and does, for Augustine, intervene in individuals' lives. And the form of that intervention takes the form of a term that we've already introduced, which is grace. What grace is grace is the breaking into an individual's life of an external reality that's always been there. It's always been there. But for various reasons, all related to sin, both individual and structural, has been obscured, that is allowed to break through finally. It's like the pit, again, if you've ever looked at AA literature or any literature about getting clean, it almost always says that one of the necessary steps in order to get clean is to what? One is usually reaching rock bottom in one way or another, where you become totally helpless. But then the flip side of total helplessness is an openness to the possibility of an external reality that can what? Lift you up. Well, it's something like this. is going on. A lot of this AA stuff is just borrowing from these forms of theology and then just sort of changing the nature of what's going on and leaving parts of it vague. But it's basically this. It's basically this in one way or another. So in the form of grace, God breaks into your life, and I'll leave it for a much longer discussion, which we're not going to have time to get into, is the question of, to what degree does that happen with human beings inviting it, looking for it, asking for it, or to what degree is it just God choosing to break into your life? For Augustine, it's a very complex question, especially because we are so sinful that he thinks we're not aware of our need for God's grace, and yet there is some grounds to think that there's still sort of an ember within each of us that still looks for it, and so there has to be kind of asking for it, a cooperation with it, even before it comes. It's a long conversation. Well, we'll just say that it's very complex. The point for Augustine would be, skipping over that huge question, is that it does happen, and that it can happen, and it does happen. And so what happens in that is, the first sort of thing you realize, the first conclusion you come to is, I am sick. I am a sinner. And it's not this sense of like someone has imposed this idea, like you're a bad person, and you've absorbed that. And it's been like a false absorption. You're not actually a bad person. Someone's been lying to you. No, you realize that I have been living my whole life delusionally as if I were my own God. And I have become, because of that, a very destructive person in small ways or in large ways, but destructive nonetheless, insofar as my primary goal throughout every single day I live is to satisfy my desires. And that is that's how I structure my life. And you become aware, one, that that's your reality, and two, that that's a false reality, that that's not actually who you are. Just like I become such a drunk that I couldn't even imagine myself without booze. But now I realize, one, how terrible it is to be a drunk, and two, that's not who I am. Like, it has nothing to do with me at all. Like, at all. And so that begins what? That begins the process of healing. So this is what's called conversion. And conversion then starts a process of moving towards becoming more like God, which, imported into a Christian conception, is becoming more like Christ. And what that is healing your nature. Because insofar as God is more intimate to you than you are to yourself. When you become like God, you become most who you authentically are. And again, it's a process of healing. How does that process work? Well, if you fix love, right? If instead of having the person's love be burrowed into himself or herself, they get torn out and redirected to their proper destination, then the idea is that, well, you'll, for the first time in your life, begin seeing properly. Instead of seeing people as like threats or opportunity or ways to get something, where you're smiling to them when they're in your face, and then behind you, like, roll your eyes. Oh, I have to deal with this person. Or, like, you treat everybody like, when you want something, it's like when you're in a job interview, like, you're just like the most amazing, engaged, open, kind, generous person in a job interview, but it only lasts for 25 minutes. Instead of seeing people as points of extraction to get things that you want, or threats, or just like homeless people, you see them as beings like you, which is to say, made in the image and likeness of God. So you actually see them in their independent realities, not just as a resource for you. And as you begin, and you see yourself that way too. So you don't want to abuse yourself either, insofar as you see yourself as having intrinsic value. So insofar as you begin to fix reason, your will now is operating according to a true representation of reality rather than a false representation of reality, which means you'll be able to act on the right desires, have better intentions, do better actions, establish better habits, and become a better person. And better here means become more like, one, the fullness of your humanity, which is still vague, but two, what that means, insofar we're looking at this in a Christian paradigm, the fullness of humanity is seen in the Christ. That for Christians, what it means to be fully alive and fully human is not an abstract question or defined in an abstract way. It can be, but ultimately all those abstractions take their ground, take upon their flesh, if you will, in the person of Christ. So you don't become God, but you become God-like in this process. And what that ultimately means is that you are not able to sin. You're not able to sin. And what that means in turn is that you're finally free. Now again, we can look at that and say, isn't that just another contradiction? You're not able to sin, and that's what defines free will. Remember, this is free choice down here, the choice of an addict. Up here, this is free will. So what is the difference? Well, free will is being not able to sin. So what is Augustine doing? Again, he's not making some silly logical error here. What's he up to? Well, one of the ways that the battle between good and evil has classically been, not classically, in the past, like when I was a kid, was oftentimes portrayed as that there'd be somebody at a party and that person would be like experiencing temptation. What would happen? Like, ooh, should I do that or should I not do that? So all of a sudden, the you with the devil, it's your face, but in the devil garb, the little red nylon suit for some reason. That's what the devil wears of you, right? Just like poking you and like whispering, "Come on, you want to do it? You want to do it. It's gonna be fun. It's not gonna be a problem. Look, no one's looking anyway. You're gonna get away with it. It's not even such a big deal. It's like not only are you going to get away with it, but it's not really even bad. It's just these social constructions." Then you have the angel you on the other side saying, "Don't listen to him. You know that it's your duty not to." And then what's always the outcome? Well, at least if it's the family version of it, it's okay. You look at the angel like, okay, but it's like, I won't do it. But you're so depressed that you won't do it. Right? Like that's how this model is. Like, I guess I can't do it. But you're bummed. It's like, I wish I could do it, but there's these powers out there that say that I can't do it. That's a nightmare way to live, where the good thing, what is right and true and good is a downer. And what's good, what's evil is an upper. That's precisely the view here that we have. Is that anytime we're doing something good, it's like, oh, okay, fine. I'll do it. I'm not going to like it. That's part of the addiction. In and through the healing, what it means to be not able to sin is that you don't have a battle anymore. There's no break within you between part of you that is hell-bent on your destruction and part of you that is trying to keep you alive, but it's just really boring. You become what you do, and you become good, and becoming good means what? It means you do what is good. You love as God loves to the mode that it's possible, the degree that it's possible for a human being, and it gives you great delight. It makes you happy because you're finally free from the addiction. So think about this. Every person I've ever met who, and God bless them, has overcome an addiction because they've gone through the process, can tell me how many days they've been sober, even if it's been years. And again, God bless them. That's an amazing feat. It's an amazing act of will. It's an amazing transformation, right? It should give hope to everybody. And at the same time, think of it this way. Think of what that looks like on the inside, right? That every day they have to choose not to do something that is so present to them that they're aware of what day that they're on. And again, it's amazing work. But what if they could wake up one day and forget that they were addicted? Forget that they had to count. Forget the counting. Forget the battle. Forget the temptation. It's just gone. Just gone. That's freedom, you see? That's true freedom. True freedom is understood in this model as a freedom from the self-destructive forms of slavery that we all live in the interim without grace. It's freedom from the battle, understood as temptation. And it's freedom for living fully without being held down by all the different self-destructive and other destructive tendencies that we have. So if I could put it this way, perhaps that'll help. Think of somebody who genuinely loves you, a mother, a father, a friend, and ask yourself this: would they be capable of stabbing you in the back, meaning like telling some terrible lie about you, or going online and spreading really vicious rumors, just totally fabricating something in order to destroy who you are? Are they free to do that? And part of you would say, well, I mean, technically speaking, yeah. I mean, it's not like anybody's tied their hands or coerced them. Like saying, if you know you're forced to do this, it's like, no, yeah, they could do it. Would they do it? No, not if they love you. See, that's the same thing here. It's not that people can't sin in a sense that they're being held back from sinning. They're being restrained physically or somehow. Well, I mean, this is moving into after death. That'll be the last point I end on. It's that the idea of sin, the idea of the embrace of death, so nauseates them that it's just inconceivable that they would do it. Like, is it conceivable for you that you would seek to destroy the person you love the most? If you really love them, then yes, right? It's not that you can't do it. It's that it's not in you at all. So that's what this process is. It's a process of cleansing. It's a process of healing. It's a process of becoming whole so that you don't even think about doing or being something that embraces death. And now you're finally free. This process for Augustine culminates in unity with the divine, which is ultimately something that starts in this life, but only culminates in the other life, insofar as soul, spiritual, becomes in unity with pure spirit itself in the form of God. So it's not that we can totally attain it here, but we can certainly get glimpses of it. And the glimpses that we have take this kind of form. It's a sort of groundedness and centeredness, and I know those are very loaded terms nowadays, so I'll say groundedness and centeredness in God, in and through Christ in this model, not just generically, in a sense that your desires are coming to rest in such a way, not that you're becoming sort of inert or you like stop moving through life, but rather that there's a kind of loss of the frenetic nature of anxiety that can cling, or we cling to, as creatures who become aware of their own deaths and aware of the fact that anything that we accomplish can be taken away from us in a second, and aware that ultimately we have no control over staying alive, that like it's all a matter of time for us. And so we can suppress that deep down, but it's going to pop up in all these different ways, psychologically and morally, and in terms of how we treat ourselves and others. Well, what if you could just have zero anxiety to the extent that it's possible? Like you become so united to the nature of reality, the true nature of reality that loves you so much that it gave its life, his life for you, and you move into the embrace of that it doesn't really matter what happens to you. That's not to say that you want bad things to happen to you, or that there won't be any suffering. In fact, one of the signs of being this life is that suffering doesn't break you. Suffering actually becomes an opportunity to show how that you are loved, because you love even when you don't feel like it, which is the paradigmatic form of love that we see in Christ on the cross, right? Christ is in absolute agony and loving in absolute agony. Christ doesn't turn towards hatred. Christ doesn't turn towards destruction, right? Christ absorbs all of that. And so, and that's not also say that life will be suffering, that there won't be some sort of radical transformation. That certainly can be the case here too. But the point is whatever the particular formulation of your life is going to take, the things are going to happen to you or not happen to you, you're okay. And you're okay because in that act of turning towards God, everything else gets put back into its place. Everything is now perceived accurately for what it is. So is money good? Absolutely. It's really, really helpful. Is money the absolute good? It's absurd to say it's the absolute good from this point of view. Any relationship you're in that's like a good one, like a friendship or romantic relationship, are those good? Potentially, yes. Like, excellent. Is your whole life, like, would you lose everything if you broke up with this person broke up with you? No, it would be painful, but I'd be okay. Because again, you're anchored in reality itself, and now seeking to conform yourself, moving from God to God with the assistance of grace towards that peace. And what peace is in this model, what eternal peace is satiation, meaning you're not hungry anymore. You're most alive when your desires are, in a sense, asleep. It's not that they've been wiped away, but they're asleep now, and you move from desire to enjoyment. Enjoyment meaning unity of that which you possess and that which possesses you. So this has massive ethical implications and massive political implications. The political one in particular, we're going to look at the next lecture when we look at the two cities of God. But let me just end with this, looking at the ethical implications of this. Well, one is that we recognize that we are what we become. But two, what St. Augustine wants us to see is that we are fundamentally broken. We have fundamentally broken ourselves. And so we will become, without the intervention of a force that is calling us out of our own self-imposed darkness, we will become more and more that which we actually deep down hate, which is death. So it's like you become, we're so terrified of death that we actually want to become death ourselves. This is a weird psychological phenomenon. But if that can be broken into, if we invite that kind of breaking through of that shell that we create, then there is this possibility, so that the moral life, doing good becomes being good, and being good feeds into doing good, and that moves into a kind of state of being where we're finally free. And as far as we're finally free, we're finally at peace. The other alternative, for Augustine at least, is this: living hell now in one way or another, and absolute hell by our own choice for eternity. It goes back to that 0 or 1 of the two forms of love. So we're going to spin out the political implications of this in the next lecture. But if you haven't done the readings yet that are associated with this, I encourage you to read them, and I'll see you all in a little bit. Thanks. Take care.